everyone, and welcome. You have made it. Here is the first day of Victober, and it fills my heart with such joy. I cannot help but be extremely effusive with just how I talk about the fact that we are now in the first day of Victober. I am delighted to be introducing this collaborative video. I didn't know if I would have inspiration for one, and then the thought came to me, I love hearing generally what it is about Victorian literature that people love. So a huge thank you to the people that were so generous with their time and submitted clips for this. I put out a general invitation. You didn't have to have a BookTube channel, so there are some familiar faces and some new faces. Anyone who does have a channel or social media presence, I will link down below, and I hope that you thoroughly enjoy this video. Of course, there are many things about Victorian literature that I love, but I have to say that two stuck out to me that I wanted to tell you about today. The first is that I love Victorian novels feel like kind of a 2-for-1, 3-for-1, and sometimes even 6-for-1 kind of a novel. They don't always stick to a specific genre. I think now with book publishing and marketing being what it is, everything has to be so just stick to a specific framework, because if book marketing doesn't know how to market it, then they don't really know what to do with it. In the Victorian era, the novel was really having a rebirth, and it was coming into its own. And so I love stories like David Copperfield, where you have some romance in there. You also have a lot of humor. You also have some tragedy and some mysterious plot lines. And Anthony Trollope's Can You Forgive Her? The same goes for that. I just love the breadth and the depth that a novel can go into and balance so many plot lines. Sometimes it's nice just to have a novel with one plot line. You know, you're following these couple of characters, and that's great. And there are some Victorian novels that are like that I love. But I do love kind of how much story and ground you can cover in one novel because of the generous page count. And so that when you get to the end, you feel bereft when you're done, because you just have been spending so much time with these characters, doing life with them, and you don't know how to move on. So I just love the depth with which you get to know the characters. I love the intricacies of the surroundings that they are in, the minutia of their daily lives, and then the different flavors that you can have within one novel. One novel can have you crying, you're laughing so hard, can have you weeping because of the sad things, or it can have you filled with rage over the dastardly deeds of certain characters. And I find that so invigorating, and there's nothing like a Victorian novel to me. And then the second reason is in this modern era where it is kind of the challenges that we have in life. The subliminal messaging is that it's always someone else's fault when life is hard. When in reality, I think more that it's just living in a fallen world, living as a human being, existing is really hard. And so this kind of culture where in Jane Eyre, she says, "We were born to strive and endure." And ever since I noticed that quote, it has not left me, and I find it to be so grounding and a great thing to pivot off of in the day-to-day struggles, when things aren't going right, when things break down, when you have kind of interpersonal issues and struggles that are happening. I find that the characters trying to make the world a better place in Victorian novels makes me want to make the world a better place. Seeing the challenges that they face and not kind of just collapsing and giving up, just having a lot of grit and determination about them and trying to overcome those obstacles is so inspiring. And whether it's things that seem insignificant, like the dynamic that Molly Gibson has to live with in her household when she has a very frustrating stepmother to live with, or when it's characters like Jane Eyre, whose life circumstances are quite challenging and quite hard. I find that seeing their character arc, their story arc, where you see the stuff that they are really made of. In the era of Redcliffe, certain characters that you think will just fade into oblivion because of the challenges that they face, you see truly the stuff that they are made of. So I am delighted to be Victobering with you again. Please enjoy the rest of this video, and I cannot wait for the month ahead of us. Have a lovely day.
Hello, I'm Katie from Books and Things, and I'm excited to be joining one of Kate Howe's wonderful Victober collaborative videos again. And I was trying to think of how I could explain why I love Victorian literature in a very concise way, which is quite hard because there are so many reasons why I love Victorian literature. But I think actually probably the main reason why I really love Victorian literature and why it's Victorian literature that has like such staying power for me and that I keep returning to is because I find the history of the Victorian period really, really interesting. It was a time of great political, social, economic, cultural, technological change, and the way that the authors of the time kind of wrote about and interacted with all those changes, often critiquing the society around them and commenting on the things in the world about them that they disapproved of, and challenging the norms and expectations of their time. That's something I find really, really interesting in Victorian literature. Looking at the kind of fascinating culture of Victorian Britain, but also kind of the way that so many writers were writing against it, or like really engaging with it in interesting ways. I think it is really the history of the Victorian period that keeps drawing me back to Victorian literature, because it means that even when I read a work of Victorian literature that I don't like, I still find it really, really interesting because I can get something out of it as a historian, I suppose, rather than as a reader. Like, there's always something in a Victorian book that I find fascinating, even if I don't enjoy it, and that means that all Victorian literature is sort of fascinating for me, and I think that is one of the reasons why I love it, because I just find the history so, so interesting.
Hi there, Victober friends. I'm Celeste, and here's why I love Victorian literature. When I was a little girl, I used to attend an all-girls private school, and it was there that I first picked up a copy of the book Jane Eyre. And I could easily imagine going through the old hallways of our school that I was Jane Eyre at Lowood. I also loved the fact that Jane loved nature and roamed the moors, and I was a big nature girl too. I used to go out and collect rocks and minerals and walk along the little creek running through our backyard and neighborhood. I used to love roaming through the muddy fields and lying down and looking up at the clouds. So like many of you, I was absolutely convinced that I was Jane Eyre. And it's also an era of echoes, a museum of lost sounds, days gone by, where horse hooves still clomp on cobblestones and where you can still see hundreds of stars at night if you go out into the fields. It's a place where people are still growing their own food, and it's very much farm to table. And although the Industrial Revolution has begun, it hasn't overtaken everyone yet. People still know how items are made and how items are crafted. Basket weaving, the aroma of bread baking, stoking the ashes in a fireplace, just all of these aromas and sensory perceptions are still vivid, and the old ways of doing crafts are still known to everyone, shoeing horses and all of that. And there's also a sense of nature and of sort of holding one's breath as though you're standing at a crossroads, and on one side of you is the farm and the church spire and the farm fields and the haycocks and all of that, and on the other side is a road into a great city with its industrial smokestacks and buildings, and so you're sort of standing there on the cusp of all of it on an evening right before everything would change forever. That's why I love Victorian literature. It's sort of like holding one's breath in Camelot before everything changed.
Hey everyone, it's Stephanie from msrichardsreads. One thing I love about Victorian literature is how intense it is. There was some overlap between the Romantics and the Victorian era, and the combination of those two is just so perfect for me. We see characters just completely euphoric in the happiest times of their lives, but we also see them in the depths of despair and the lowest of the low. And the intensity of these emotions just really grab me as a reader. And I love being able to experience these emotions with the characters, and it draws me closer to the novel as a result and really creates a very memorable reading experience.
Hi everyone, my name is Nada, and today I'm going to tell you about the reasons I love Victorian literature. Number one, I love the wit and humor found in Victorian literature, both the subtle and the laugh out loud kinds. I actually vibe with it more than I do with humor found in modern books. Number two, it's so cozy and domestic and perfect for when you need something to relax. Strangely, even when you're reading a dark or gothic piece, there's just something so warm and comforting about Victorian literature. Number three, it lends itself perfectly to the audio format. Number four, it makes for fantastic film and TV. Number five, it's a wonderful lens into the contemporary point of view on the relevant social and political issues of the time, which is perfect for history nerds like myself. Number six, it suits different moods and times of the year. So you can read something by Mary Elizabeth Braddon or Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu in autumn, a Dickens set in London in winter, something like Wives and Daughters or Deerbrook in spring. There's something for every season and every mood. Number seven, it helped introduce me to the wonderful Victober community, which is a safe and welcoming space filled with delightful individuals, and through which I've actually met one of my very dear friends. Hi Laura. Number eight, last, but certainly not least, it includes the iconic, timeless masterpiece that is Wuthering Heights. What more can you ask for? I hope everyone has a wonderful Victober and happy reading!
Hello, my name is Reesha and I love classics, specifically Victorian classics. I love Victorian literature so much, and I would say there are two major reasons why. The first reason is pretty straightforward. I fell in love with literature because of reading Victorian literature. These were the books and authors which basically paved the path for me to explore more reading and more books in general. I tried a lot of different kinds of books before I found that this is what I really love. And the second reason why I stuck with Victorian literature for so long is because of the way the writers discuss topics. So they talk about different social issues, right? They're talking about class, morality, feminism. These are like really heavy topics. But the way these authors talked about them was so subtle, was so impactful, yet not harsh, that it just resonated more with me as a reader. Along with these engaging plots and dramatic, stories, they're also including very important themes in the core of their stories. Because of that, it's not just a storybook, it's so much more. And as modern readers, we not only get an insight into the times, but also how these writers try to, help the people of the time through their stories, which is inspirational. A lot of the problems they faced are still something we face, and it just gives you an insightful look into how to deal with them. So I would say those are the top two reasons why I love Victorian literature so much, and that's why I'm so excited for Victober.
Hi Kate, and hi everyone. I would say that the reason I love Victorian literature so much is to do with the plots and the writing of them. In terms of some Victorian writers, we know that a lot of what they're writing is to do with the way that a piece is going to sound, and I very much like thinking about that when it comes to literature. And there is something within the storytelling that I feel like you don't see that often nowadays when it comes to fiction. Another thing that I quite like about Victorian literature is it seems that it's coming from a time when there were very few rules when it came to writing a novel. So it feels like there is a bit more freedom of expression because the writers are really playing everything by ear and figuring out the ways in which a novel should be written and the ways that characters should be represented in fiction. It's also one of those things where for years I struggled to read Victorian literature because I felt as though it was a lot more highbrow than it is. And when I knuckled down and realised that the creators were actually writing work that was simply created for entertainment purposes and for the masses, that I began to realise that perhaps Victorian literature isn't as impenetrable as I thought in the past. And as soon as I got past that, I found myself really enjoying and appreciating the ways in which they told stories. And I think that that's what I like, is the storytelling aspect and the idea that the writers were really free to do anything because they were creating this form, or at least advancing it further than we had seen at this point. And it's also where you get to see so many of the origins of genres that people enjoy today. There's just a great many things within Victorian literature that I like, and it's also one of those reasons that I'm always grateful whenever Victober comes around, because it reminds me of this dearth of books that for the rest of the year I seem to ignore.
Hey guys, I'm Tori from the channel Good Strong Words, and I have 5 reasons why I love Victorian literature that I'm going to run through. First off, I love the culture of the time and the experience we get, especially through novels, to really understand the emotions behind that class system. 2, I love relationship-driven books. So many people discuss plot-driven versus character-driven. I love books that are more driven by relationships and how they develop. I feel like they have a good balance between plot and character, because you're learning about these characters obviously as individuals, but also there are things happening that cause the relationship to be a focal point and to develop. And I feel that Victorian literature really does that amazingly well. In fact, most things that I read tend to have relationships as a very central focus. 3, they're beautifully written. I love the style of the Victorian era in literature. 4, they always develop a great atmosphere, and just not only the writing itself, but just, yeah, the way they word things and explore things, it just creates such a wonderful atmosphere to read in. And number 5 is actually a little bit separate from Victorian literature itself and more involved with what happens on YouTube. I love the community that surrounds Victorian literature. I love hearing discussions of Victorian literature, and I love connecting with people over Victorian literature. So things like this, a readathon centered around Victorian literature, like I love that the hosts have been able to pull this together and do this every year, because it really helps me love Victorian literature even more than I already do.
Hey there, it's Mitzi from Mitzi Reads and Writes, and I fell in love with Victorian literature as a teenager. The very first time I read Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre was the perfect blend of mystery and secrets and gothic elements, and it was set in the perfect time period for me. The Victorian period has always fascinated me because it's an explosion of discoveries in science, in the arts, in industry, and all of these things are explored through their literature. And so I find that to be fascinating and super interesting too. I also find it to be interesting that this time period, there are a lot of novels written about women and women's roles in society, when we have the whole period itself named in honor of a woman, one of the most powerful people at the time. And so I find that to be such an interesting part of the whole situation, that we have a woman on the throne, and then we have all of these novels exploring women's roles in our society. So that to me has always fascinated me as well. But to me, the Victorian period is the pinnacle of the English novel. I think that the Victorians perfected it, and many people created masterpieces during that time. And so I'm on a journey to read every single one. So happy Victober. I hope you discover a new favorite this year.
Hi, my name is Tiffany, and my channel name is Beautiful Minutia. And I was really excited when I saw that Kate's topic this year for a collaborative Victober video was what you love about Victorian literature. I think it would probably be better answered for me, like, what don't you love about Victorian literature? But I'm going to attempt to tackle this because I really truly love pretty much everything about Victorian literature. Honestly, probably my very favorite thing is the language. I just sink into the language of Victorian literature and just adore the description and character exploration and those kinds of things. And obviously different authors have different depths in terms of how pastoral or descriptive the nature writing is, or how deep they go into character development, because there's so many different genres of Victorian literature. But as a whole, I find that a lot of Victorian literature does have really beautiful nature writing and does have like an exploration into characters that helps me really connect to them. I find Victorian literature extremely rewarding to read because there's a slower process to it. And I think that Victorian literature teaches patience at times, because I think a lot of books that are really popular right now, modern books that are just coming out in new releases, a lot of them are really fast-paced, and it takes longer to get to that payoff for Victorian literature, but it's so rewarding once you reach the end. I think particularly of Charles Dickens novels that are full of all these characters and all these threads, and he draws them together in such a meaningful way by the end, and I feel like each character kind of gets their just desserts, whether or not they're really terrible characters and they get what's coming to them, or characters that are lovely and have endured a lot of hardship that are then kind of rewarded at the end of the story. Another thing that I really love about Victorian literature is I just absolutely adore the historical components to it, because the Victorian era, it comes with the industrialization of England and a lot of progress in technological things, in medicinal things, in scientific discoveries, so many different things like that. We find just so much historical relevance to Victorian literature, and I feel like I am learning so much when I am reading Victorian literature, whether I'm learning the historical context or whether there are words that I don't know that I'm looking up, all of those kinds of things. It's just absolutely lovely. And so I really enjoy that, and I enjoy a lot of Victorian literature also has kind of some social activism for the day, and I find it really interesting to see what were the topics that Victorians were really passionate about, what were the hot button topics that people are landing on different sides, and to see the exploration of those topics as well. So I just feel like Victorian literature, not in addition to being enjoyable and entertaining at times, it's also just so enriching to my life, and I think that that is why I appreciate Victorian literature so very much.
Hello everyone, happy Victober. My name is Art and I'm from Art's Bookshelf Odyssey, and I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about why I love Victorian literature. It helps connect us to the past, it slows us down, it invites us to think and meditate on the story that's being written. It takes us back to the time when people took the time not just to write a functional story, but to make it beautiful. And there's such great beauty in its language, its themes, its stories. They can be just as romantic or scary or fantastical as anything that's written today. It takes you deep into societal issues, but yet makes it understandable and accessible. You know, if I were to say, let's have a lecture on class division between the south of England and the northern industrial England, you would probably find that, how fascinating, how boring, right? But you put it in a story like Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, and not only does it become a compelling social critique, but it's a fantastic story of two people who are from opposite ends of society who meet, and in spite of their differences, they learn to work together and they fall in love, and it's just so beautiful. Some other social aspects that Victorian literature explores is, for instance, the issues of marriage and the rights of women. Some stories will explore just how unfair it was and how women were so often mistreated, as were many people of different classes and of different nationalities. We learn about their struggles not through reading a dry and dusty history book, but by reading the stories that they wrote. Stories like The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, my personal favorite Bronte sister. It just tells the story of a woman named Helen, and it tells about her and her marriage with an abusive husband, and she struggles with what she is supposed to do according to society, and what is best for her and for her son. And it is an exciting and thrilling story that keeps you on the edge of your seat, makes you feel sympathetic to those who are struggling, and even will have commentary on our world today still. And that's another reason I love Victorian literature, is because it is still relevant. It is still speaking to the issues of our day. And part of that is unfortunate because we've gone, almost 200 years now, and we're still struggling with the same things. They give a voice to those who didn't have a voice. Some other reasons I love Victorian literature is that it creates emotional, powerful journeys with the beauty of language. For instance, A Christmas Carol has, though some would dismiss it as just a holiday story, it contains some of the most beautifully written and gut-wrenching scenes you'll read in Victorian literature. Other stories like Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, and especially A Tale of Two Cities, a fantastic story that teaches the beauty of love and redemption. Just that line, "I wish you to know that you have been the last dream of my soul." The journey that character goes on is so compelling. There's just nothing like it. So I know I could talk about this all day long, but hopefully I'll give you a couple ideas as to why I love Victorian literature. Don't be afraid if you haven't yet. Pick up your first Victorian literature and dive in. Thanks again. Happy reading.
Hi, my name is Catherine. I love Victorian literature, and one of the things I love the most about Victorian literature is not just its variety in general, but its variety of long novels. Now, bear with me. I know some people say, but aren't they kind of annoying because they go on and on forever? Some people were obviously paid by the word, and maybe they should have trimmed a few chapters or 10. And it's true, there are definite examples of that where I am like, come on, calm down. But for the most part, they become, instead of long, grueling books, if you find the right writers, the ones with skill, it's an investment. Now, of course, in the month of October, Victober, we like to read a lot of novels and finish them within the month, and that's great, and that is one wonderful activity. But in general, I can start a Victorian novel early in the year and finish it later in the year and just live with it for the whole year, and it's not a loss for me. It's a good time. It's probably better if I do continue reading it throughout the year and not just drop it and pick it up. But even when I do that sometimes, it's exciting. It's like going back to a friend, if that sounds a little weird, but I have done that before where I've left off and come back, and even that can be really good. It's not a judgment on the particular book. However, what I'm really thinking of is some of the writers were paid or employed to write for journals, which meant that chapters were printed in installments and published so that people weren't reading it in quick succession. They were like I said, living with it, and it's lovely. And there are so many books to choose from. Of course, it's me, and I'm a little bit of a broken record lately about Anthony Trollope, but he is one really good example. He did write shorter novels as well, and to be honest, some of his short novels are not my favorites. Most of my favorite Anthony Trollope books are his longer ones. The Barsetshire novels are mostly long, and I mean, that's not just one book, it's a whole series of long books, and they're wonderful. I still haven't gotten very far in the Palliser series, but this is the one I'm up to, and look how long it is. I mean, I have my work cut out for me, and I'm not complaining. And I've read other ones, of course, The Standalone, The Way We Live Now. If you haven't read it yet, I know it's being probably talked about a lot this year, but it is fantastic. It doesn't lag. It moves in a wonderful way where you're living with the characters, you're getting to know them, you're interested in the plot, you want to see the plot move along, but there's no rush. It's fantastic. That's how life should be lived. We're so frantic sometimes. The Victorians knew how to, sometimes, sit down and appreciate life a little bit. So that is one thing I love about Victorian literature. And I hope you do too.
Hi everyone, and happy Victober. I'm Marissa from Blatantly Bookish. Let's see, why do I love Victorian literature? Well, many reasons really. I feel like Victorian literature embodies all of my favorite things about literature in general. It's this perfect blend and balance of rich and intricate plot structures, memorable characters, and interesting themes that layer and build on each other. Victorian themes are especially exciting for me to read about because there are so many cultural, social, political, and economic forces at play in the time period. And I feel like the values and concerns established by the Victorians lay the groundwork for a lot of issues that are still talked about and still exist in modern society, particularly regarding race and gender. So there's this joy of exploring and learning about a different time period, while also feeling very connected to the things that matter today. There is a ton of discussion in Victorian literature about identity and legitimacy, about various social hierarchies and power dynamics within relationships, whether that's relationships between workers and employers, between the genders, or between Britain and her colonies. And it's all layered in this really beautiful and intricate way with different plot lines that weave in and out of each other and come together neatly like a jigsaw puzzle at the very end. We follow characters who evoke deep emotional responses for me and whose stories feel very real as they grow and change throughout the course of the novel. Their stories are so rewarding to follow, and it's amazing how in Victorian literature there are also a slew of minor characters who may only appear for a few chapters of a massive book, but have a way of capturing my attention as well. I love how the more Victorian literature I read, the more interesting and nuanced all of these themes and stories become. The Victorian era is when the novel really becomes more respected as an art form and comes into its own. So you get all of this exciting experimentation with all aspects of the novel: plot, characterization, genre, you name it. And you get this wonderful sense of freedom and fun with the writing style too. There's experimentation with inserting the author into the text and with different points of view, and there are also just these beautiful descriptive passages about landscape and characterization. There are just some brilliant, exquisite passages of writing in Victorian books. Victorian literature manages to contain so much in each book and yet not become pretentious or overworked. And because it's so chock full of substance and rewarding and impactful, Victorian literature holds up to multiple rereads for me as well. I could go on for far longer about this subject, but this is meant to be brief and I can't wait to hear from everyone else. So if you want to hear me ramble more about this topic, I posted a video last October called Why I Love Victorian Literature, where I chat in greater depth and give even more reasons why I love Victorian literature. So thank you, Kate, for putting this wonderful collaboration together, and happy Victober, everyone.
Hi, my name is Rainey, and my channel is Rainy Day Reads, and I'm here to tell you why I love Victorian literature. Now, I love Victorian literature. I had to think about this for a while, and I really love it because of the characters. And if you know me, that might sound weird because I am a very plot-driven reader generally. But the characters in most, if not all, Victorian novels are just so rich. And probably because the novels are so long, generally, they have so much room for growth and development. If you've read Jane Eyre, for instance, there are so many characters in that go through a lot of character growth, and just even throughout the story, Mr. Rochester is just, he's a plot all in his own right. And Jane just goes through a lot of emotions and character development in herself, becoming a more independent, self-aware person throughout the entire book. A Dickens novel, basically any of them, you could find so many just ridiculous and entertaining characters that even if it had no plot, which any Dickens novel you read has many interesting plots, The characters themselves are just so interesting that it wouldn't even matter. They could just be talking and it would be either hilarious or heartbreaking. So yeah, I just love the characters in Victorian novels. And when I find a new favorite character, because there are just so many Victorian novels in the world, when I find a new favorite, it just thrills me. So yeah, I'm just excited to read some new Victorian literature this month and hopefully find a new favorite, interesting, and possibly ridiculous character. Thank you. Bye.
Hi, I'm Milena from the channel Milena Reads, and Kate kindly invited me to talk about the reason why I love Victorian literature. Over the last year, I have become a reader who basically reads everything, but my love for classics is very much present. Through Victober, I started reading Victorian literature in 2019, I think. So in a way, I can still be considered a newbie, but I've read quite a bit since then. So I wanted to start with my first book I read as Victorian literature. I'm not sure if it was a wise start because it was quite challenging at the time, especially because English is my second language and I read this in English as well. But it was such a unique reading experience, and that is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. I read this with a book club. None of us really knew what we were getting into, especially me as the host. But this was such a unique experience both in writing, because I had never read such lyrical, beautiful writing that was both slow and captivating at the same time, and also incredibly heartwarming. You can see that the book has been published in different parts because you can just feel the time going by. Even though it is so slow, you feel that you just live with the characters and that you live in the world for a while. And the Victorian era and Victorian literature almost started to feel like a fantasy world. I knew so little about it, especially everything set in England. I didn't know that much about English history, but to get to slowly know it through the eyes of a female main character set in 18 something, which I found incredibly fascinating, because especially in North and South, both the individual of our main character, Margaret, and the political with North and South England, with socialism, with working class people, is so present in this book, and the balance is really, really beautiful. And I don't think I experienced that in combination with the beautiful lyrical writing, and I was just incredibly captivated by it. It's still something unique that I can't quite place and that you can find nowhere else except for in Victorian literature. That kind of started me off with my journey, and then I discovered, of course I knew their names, but I discovered for myself the Brontes. Well, I started with Agnes Grey and Jane Eyre. I truly love those. My incredible love was sparked when I read Wuthering Heights for the second time, and I was just so captivated again by the writing, which is so gorgeous. Especially Wuthering Heights almost feels like you're in this fantasy world that feels so far removed from your own, but the emotions feel so incredibly real, with writing that is challenging and incredibly comforting at the same time. Getting back to the more political, I read The Tenant of Whitehall Hall, which is still one of my favorite books. I loved this on the first read. I was just enamored with the bravery and the courage of Anne Bronte by writing about a woman who leaves her husband in a time where that is incredibly socially unacceptable. During my first Victober, I read As of the D'Urbervilles with the same book club as I read North and South with, and this broke my heart into a million pieces, and I found again how Victorian literature can combine incredibly beautiful but challenging prose with an individual story that is so heartbreaking and so intense and has that political message. When it came to the more personal, Middlemarch is one of my all-time favorite books by George Eliot. I think if I find a Victorian book that I seem to really, really love, I always deeply fall in love with the author as well. With the Brontes, of course, I am deeply in love with them. But George Eliot and Thomas Hardy and Elizabeth Gaskell as well, those are always my go-to authors. I am not entirely sure why I love Victorian literature so much, but it's that unique quality that you don't find in any other category of literature. I think it is the way that the authors intended their work to be read over a longer period of time, where you really make these characters and this world and the stories a part of your life. Looking at Gaskell and Dickens as well, they wanted to do more with their work than entertain. I think it was really a time in which the big novels were being shaped that we now know and love. And another thing that I love about Victorian literature is that we have Victober, in which we read Victorian literature together, and I always find new people and new friends with whom I can share this love for classic literature. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much, Kate, for inviting me, and I'm really curious to see what the other booktubers have to say. Doei!
Hello, Kate and all bookish friends. I'm very excited to talk today to you about why I love Victorian literature. Victober really is one of the most wonderful times of the year. Kate, thanks for the opportunity for all of us to share our bookish thoughts. So I think that in a nutshell, the reason why I love Victorian literature so much, why it's possibly my favorite genre for sure of fiction, is simply its impact on my life. And as I thought about why I find Victorian literature so impacting, I think the first reality does have to do with the actual content in Victorian literature. What I mean by that, and I don't mean it to sound prudish in any way, but I simply know that I can trust the hands that I'm in. Because even when Victorian literature is dealing with extremely difficult realities like poverty or violence, injustice, that these issues are dealt with in such a way that they're not explicitly expounded on the page. And so I find that just that fact alone allows me to engage more deeply with the text, because I can let my guard down a little bit more easily. So because of my trust of the content, the trust of the hands I'm in, I feel like I can engage at a deeper level. And I one time heard literature compared to a mirror that we hold up in front of ourselves that can show us things about ourselves, both that we like and that we don't like. And I find for me that when I can read a book with my guard down, that I can do that more deeply. So I love that Victorian literature is able to be a mirror in which I can look and see my life. I can see the ways in which I completely share my humanity with these characters, and also the way that I feel convicted and rebuked by these characters, by who they are, by the way they act and their behavior. And so I just find that incredibly rewarding and fulfilling, because I find that it's life-changing to read this material. I think another thing that I really like, why it impacts me so much, is because I heard another booktuber, Alex Cannell, talk very compellingly about a study that he did with 20th century literature. I should probably specify and say 20th century Western literature for the most part, versus 19th century Western literature. And he came to a very compelling conclusion. He felt like a lot of 20th century literature has to do with the identity of the character. So the character is finding their identity. They're finding where they fit. They find who they are. And while that can be very powerful, I find that I often come away from 20th century literature, even literature that I enjoy, and I feel like the character is quite self-absorbed, because it's the quest for their identity the whole book long. Whereas with 19th century literature, I find that it's much more about character. I find that it's versus identity. So the character or characters on the page are dealing with the development of their character versus the discovery of their identity. I'm sure there are many exceptions, but I just find that when I'm reading 19th century literature, the arc of the characters is such that they are becoming better people. They are wanting to become better citizens. They're wanting to become more beautiful and good people. And I find that incredibly rewarding, very satisfying. And again, I feel like I'm in good hands through the process of this discovery with Victorian literature. And then of course, because I find it life-changing, because I can let my guard down, because I like the mirror it holds up in front of myself, and I like the pursuit of goodness and beauty that is discovered in the pages, I find then that the length is the cherry on top of the cake, or the sundae, as it were. I find that, of course, there are exceptions, and there are many shorter Victorian novels, short stories, novellas, plays, but I just love being able to sink my teeth into these huge Victorian novels that do all of these things, because then once you're involved with the characters in such an intimate and personal way, then why wouldn't you want it to go on for 800 pages? Because it's just so rewarding and beautiful. So that would be a nutshell as to why I love Victorian literature so much. All of these things lead to simply the fact that I find it so compelling, so rewarding, and so impactful on my personal life. So thank you again, Kate, for letting me share my thoughts with you, and I look forward to hearing all of yours. Take care, everyone.
Hi, my name is Celine, and I run the YouTube channel The Eclectic Library. And although I'm quite new to YouTube, I am not new to Victorian literature. I really love reading books from the Victorian time period, and I think one of the things that I really like about it is that it sort of takes you into this really different world, but at the same time it is very accessible. Although plenty of time has passed between now and the Victorian era, I think in terms of language and in terms of values, we still recognize a lot of the themes that Victorian authors play with, the language that they use. It's not that far away that we just have no idea what's going on. But at the same time, it feels really engaging. It feels really fascinating to just get a glimpse into what life was like just over 100 years ago. What I also really like is that there is just a huge variety of Victorian literature, and you can see that a lot of the genres that we have in literature nowadays, such as mysteries, romances, like the family saga, those kinds of books, that you can see the books that have sort of led into this genre. So there are tons of different types of books and books with different themes in the Victorian era, and you can really see like genres starting to split off, if that is something that you're interested in, which I am. I also think that a lot of Victorian prose is just so well written. There are so many authors in the Victorian era that are just excellent writers. So I think whether you like sort of the rich decadence of Oscar Wilde, or whether you're more into the sort of wry comic tone of Dickens, or maybe you're just one of those people who wants to be swept away in an epic on the moors with the Brontes, I think there are just so many different ways that Victorian authors approach writing, and they are all so skilled, and it's just beautiful and wonderful, and I could probably talk about Victorian books for a very long time. Also, last but not least, I am also someone who just likes practical things, and one of the cool things about Victorian literature is that it's all in the public domain and it's all very easily accessible, whether through Project Gutenberg or through archive.org. Even quite obscure Victorian texts, like if you go down a rabbit hole and you just want to read this one specific thing about this really specific topic, with Victorian books, you can probably find a copy of it online for free, and I think that's really wonderful. So thank you so much, Kate, for letting me join in this really fun project, and I also hope that everyone is having an excellent Victober.
Happy Victober! I'm Marta. I'm very happy to be part of this video, and I'm going to tell you what I personally love about Victorian literature. To be fair, there are quite a few things I could mention, like the beautiful writing style, or the amazing plots that Victorian authors could come up with, but I'm going to talk about two things. First of all, I love the Victorian era as a historical period generally, so reading works by authors who lived and wrote during that time makes the experience so special. It feels as if you're going back in time whenever you're opening the book. I'm personally interested in the details of everyday life. What were people wearing? What was the fashion like at the time? What did they have for breakfast? How was their day structured? What did they consider entertainment? What were the social events? But I'm also interested in Victorian life in general and Victorian society as a whole, and obviously Victorian literature does explore many aspects of it. Just to mention a few, the differences in social classes, the position of women, what were their opportunities, what was their role in society, also according to their social standing, how did that change through time? This era also saw the rise of industry. How did people react to that? What were factories like at the time? How were workers treated? I think to explore all of this is incredibly fascinating. The second thing is something that I think many people will agree. with me on, and it is the characters. I really love Victorian characters. I'm not trying to cram all authors together or all characters together. Each author has their own way of writing their characters, but I love how you can find so many great characters in Victorian literature, interesting and complex and funny, and not just on their own, but also in relation to other people. I love how the relationships are described, whether it's love or a friendship or a family bond or something negative like hate or rivalry. And another thing I really love about many Victorian characters is that you can see how they grow, how they evolve from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. A few characters I'm thinking about, Jane Eyre from Jane Eyre, or Margaret Hale from North and South, or even John Thornton from North and South, Pip from Great Expectations. You really feel as if you're going on a journey with them while you're reading the book. I hope everyone has a wonderful Victober.
Hello everyone. My name is Deea and my channel is Novel Idea, and I just wanted to tell you why I love Victorian literature. I think the main reason why I love Victorian literature is simply because it allows me to touch the past, even though it's all in my head. I can live in those places. I can walk those days out with those people. I had a professor in college who called Victorian literature evergreen. And he called it that because of the fact that it tends to be continually relevant, continually relatable in its subjects, in what it's dealing with in society and culture. Oftentimes, those things are still going on today. They look different, but they are still the same issues. They often have very clear-cut characters. That doesn't mean they're boring. Some of the most complex characters that I have ever read. I feel like because of the straightforwardness of those characters, Victorian literature is very good at portraying truth. Truth of the time, truth of humanity. It constantly rings true. Lastly, I would say that oftentimes I think of Victorian literature as dark and lovely. I think that it really gives us something that is weighty with hope. And so even though there's this great weight to much of the stories, there is oftentimes that same buoyancy of hope along with it. And I love that in my stories. And that's why I love Victorian literature. Thank you so much, Kate, for asking me to do this. Really made me think. Thanks, everyone.
Hi everyone, my name is Lisa and I live in Arizona in the United States, and I am so excited to share with you a few of my thoughts about why I love Victorian literature, because it has revolutionized my reading in the last 2 years. I'm a lifelong passionate reader and an educator of 24 years, so I've always loved reading and I've always loved the best in literature. But a reread of Jane Eyre in January of 2022 seemed to light a fire in my reading life. Somehow I had let decades go by without rereading that great book, and I can't even describe just how beautiful and deeply moving that experience was to reread Jane Eyre, and it just put me on a whole new trajectory in my reading. And since that time, January of 2022, I have read nearly only classic literature, with Victorian literature being a big part of that. I've read 74 classics in those last, 19-20 months, and 29 of them have been Victorian classics, which means that's about 40% of my reading in the last almost 2 years. And there's only a few of the Victorian classics that I've read that I didn't like much. All the rest I have loved so, so, so much. And it just made me think, why is it that I love Victorian literature so much? What makes it so different for me? Because you know what's happened is that I have not had a reading slump during that time, which is new. All of my previous years of reading, I would have reading slumps once in a while, but ever since I started reading, especially Victorian literature regularly, which means, you know, at least a couple of months, since January of 2022, I have not had any reading slumps at all. And I'm not quite sure what that's about, but it feels like it's a result of this regular intake of Victorian literature, of this beautiful writing that I love so much, and just the excitement around what to read next. So there haven't been any reading slumps, and I have loved my reading life during this time. So I've thought of many reasons why I love Victorian literature so much, but for the sake of this message, I've narrowed it down to four reasons. The first is the balance of beautiful writing with these really good plots and these rich characters. That combination isn't something that I've found so predominantly in any other period in literature. The Victorians seem to do this so well. They were beautiful writers, beautiful prose. They wove together these complicated, interesting, fascinating plots, and then these rich characters that you just don't forget and come to life for you. You know, I think of all of Dickens, all of the Bronte's writing, Trollope, Hardy, Gaskell. Every Victorian writer practically that I've picked up so far seems to do this so well, this blend of beautiful writing with amazing plots and incredibly rich characters. Secondly, I love the themes. I love what the Victorians wrote about. They wrote about gender and class and religious and spiritual themes, which are most fascinating to me. They wrote about family and marriage and industrialization and social change and romance and all these wonderful themes. North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell is one of my favorite Victorian books of all time, and every theme that I just mentioned you find in that wonderful book. And The Tenant of Wildfell Hall comes to mind too. Just wonderful things that they wrote about. Thirdly, they wrote about a love of nature. The Victorians loved nature. They loved describing it. They loved weaving it into their plots, and they did a beautiful job of it. And I love nature too. So Jane Eyre is just beautifully done. Anything by Hardy, Dickens, Gaskell also. And lastly, fourthly, I love the readability and the staying power of these books. You can reread them endlessly, I'm discovering, and you don't forget them. They stay with you, they change you, they enrich your life. It is such a blessing. So I hope that you've enjoyed my thoughts, and I just want to wish you well in your reading of Victorian literature. Enjoy and happy reading.
Hi, it's Rose from Skelly Handling About the Books. Now, why do I love Victorian literature? Because I really do. I'm going to give you three reasons. Reason number one is that I'm really a novel reader. I love reading novels. They're the things that give me the most satisfaction and joy. Not that I don't read lots of other things, but you know, they're the heart of my reading life. And the 19th century was when the novel in English really got into its stride and worked out what it could be. And you know, there was like amazing blossoming of the English novel in the Victorian period. Not that the Victorians were any slouch at other kind of literary forms and genres and so on. And that brings me to my reason number two, which is whatever it is you like, whatever it is I like, the Victorians did it. It's there for me. You know, short stories, yeah. Poetry, my second love. So rich, Victorian poetry. Drama, you know, what about Wilde and Shaw and, you know, wonderful playwrights. Non-fiction, it's a bit ponderous, Victorian non-fiction, so not my favourite, but it's certainly there and was very influential on the development of non-fiction. Then, you know, what about genres? Speculative fiction, detective fiction, romance, social and political novels, novels of ideas, character-driven stories, thrillers. It's all there. Everything you might want, you can have it. Reason number three is more personal. And that is, I think that Victorian literature really made me the reader that I am. I read a lot of Victorian children's literature as a child and loved that. And I kind of, that developed, rolled over in my sort of late childhood and early teens so that the first, adult literature that I read, was Victorian. So it was Dickens, it was Thomas Hardy, it was Charlotte Bronte and Elizabeth Gaskell, and that it formed my idea of what a book could be and how I could immerse myself in it. And that gave me so much and still does.
Hi everyone, it's Heather from Fresh Parchment. I love Victorian literature for so many reasons. I love the episodic nature that a lot of Victorian novels have. I love the language. I love the little narrative asides that authors like to give us every now and then. But more than anything else, I love the social justice issues that these novels tend to tackle. This may sound very obvious to those of you who also love Victorian literature, but I think for those outside of Victorian literature circles, it might come as a bit of a surprise. Novels from this era were taking on things like industrial reform, be that in contemporary terms in North and South, or through a historical lens in books like Shirley. They were looking at potential ways to perform the debtors' prison system in Little Dorrit. And of course, we all know Dickens's major gripe with the legal system. Looking at potential reform of the church and how money is distributed to those working within the church in things like the Barsetshire series. Looking at how the railroad might change the landscape of the English countryside, like in Cranford. Looking at what life was like for a Jewish person in Victorian England. Granted, I haven't read Daniel Deronda, but I know that factors in. Looking at women's issues, primarily thinking of the plight of the fallen woman in things like Tess of the D'Urbervilles or Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell. Again, I haven't read Ruth, but I know that's one of the main hinge points of the plot. Also looking at alcoholism and its effects in things like The Mayor of Casterbridge, and also how that can factor into abusive marriages in books like The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. There are so many wonderful social justice issues that are just taken on as the plot of this novel, and I can only imagine that they sparked really great conversations when they were published, just like they're still doing to this day.
Hello there guys, this is Christy Luis from Dostoevsky in Space. Thank you so much, Kate, for inviting me to be a part of this Victober collab. I always look forward to these so much, and I look forward to seeing everybody's favorite things about Victorian literature. So some of my favorite things about Victorian literature, honestly, it moves slowly, and this pacing is something that I've come to expect. And it's kind of nice to read something that just revels in being what it is. It's not catering to a modern reader. It knows exactly who its readership is and its target audience. I really kind of appreciate that about Victorian literature. It makes it more listenable on audiobook. It makes it easier to follow. Everything gets explained. I feel like it would be really great for high school students. I don't know why, at least my public high schools had us read like almost all modern American literature and no Victorian literature at all. And I don't know why. I feel like it would have been great for high schoolers, and you do have to get used to the style of a classic as soon as that happens. I mean, and let high school students listen to audiobooks. Why not? I really feel like Victorian books are almost made for understanding. They're just more accessible than modern works, I think, personally. I also find that because of this pacing, Victorian books are often more relaxing. They're really great for high anxiety periods or people just who have high anxiety in general. You're usually not going to have a lot of high anxiety moments when you're reading Victorian literature. Of course, that doesn't go for every book. I'm thinking of Romola here, but a lot of them, anxiety is much more muted. I also love how the characterization is so in-depth in Victorian works. We have a lot of works that are just named after a character name, and it's really like their life story, and it goes so in depth into the characters. You just won't find that in a modern book very often, because again, modern books are trying to appeal to modern audiences and they try to move quickly and chop, and Victorians were just like, Nope, you're gonna get all of my thoughts. And these are not gonna be computer edited thoughts, so it's lengthy. It's all out there for you. Also, another thing that's really nice about classics in general is the writing is usually going to be just absolutely beautiful. That's the kind of work that gets passed down the generations because it's just a joy just to read it. Like, story aside, if the writing is so beautiful, you'll just read it for that. That's what gets passed down. And so a lot of Victorian literature has really beautiful writing. And finally, I find that Victorian literature has more moral complexity than modern books. Modern books are often trying to speak to modern issues, which is something that I really appreciate, but just on a personal level, virtue was something that was really important to the Victorians, and that's not something that's important today at all to a lot of modern writers. And so you find works littered with things that are just definitely more nihilistic, whereas with Victorian literature, they were very confident and stable in their morality a lot of times. There were outliers who were kind of going against the grain with morality, but they would explain themselves very well to an audience who is more like me, honestly. I'm a Christian. That's it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this, and thank you again, Kate.